All right. Number 1. 3/10x minus 4x plus 6/5 equals 3/5. So you will have an equation and it will have fractions because they want to see if you can clear them out or if you prefer to work with them. That's your choice. But I'm going to clear out the fractions by using a common denominator, which would be, if you got a 10 and a 5, the common denominator would be 10. So I'm going to multiply every term by 10, okay? Not just the fractions, every term by 10. So when I multiply by 10, you're multiplying, if it is in fraction form, you're multiplying the top by 10, and you're going to divide by whatever is on the bottom. So I will write that underneath if you need to see that, but that would be 10 times 3, which is 30, over 10, which reduces to 3x. Minus 10 times 4x would just be 40x, plus that would be 6 times 10 is 60, but I need to divide it by 5, and that would give us 12 equals, this would be 30 over 5, which reduces to 6. So it's a lot easier to work with if you clear out those fractions, okay? So we got a basic equation. We're going to combine like terms. 3x minus 4x will give us a negative 37x, plus 12 equals 6. Get x by itself. We're going to subtract 12, and that would give us a negative 6. Divide both sides by negative 37, and the negatives make a positive, but you can't reduce 6 and 37, so you would keep it 6 over 37. Okay? Now, my labs is going to have curlicues already on the answer blank. So I've noticed on the midterm, some people put x equals in that space, and it's going to take off. Because if it has curlicues, then all you need to do is stick the number in between them, okay? So try not to type x equals, but if you do, I go through and reward the points for it, okay? But the computer will automatically take that off if you type x, okay? So make sure you just stick the number in the curlicues. And that's just a basic equation, but it did have fractions in it, okay? The second problem you would be subtract and simplify, and it's dealing with your I numbers. So 2 plus 4i in the first parenthesis, minus in the second parenthesis, negative 8 minus I. So it doesn't matter if you have 2 parentheses or 3 parentheses. If there's a negative in front of it, then you must distribute that negative before you combine like terms. Because this is very simple. You're just going to combine the whole number with the whole number, I number with the I number, but you got to change the sign on the one that carries the negative in front of it. Like that's a -1. So that's going to keep your front the same, but that becomes a +8 and a +I. So if you combine 2 plus 8, that would give us 10. And then positive 4i plus 1i is a positive 5i. So that's what you get when you subtract those two. Questions? Okay, number 3. You have 4 plus I divided by 4 minus I. So we're still dealing with our i's, but this is in division. So if you remember when we went over this, I made a point of saying that you can't have an I on the bottom of a fraction. So you're going to have to clear it out, and the only way you can do that is by multiplying by the conjugate, okay? That's the $10 word, which the conjugate is nothing but the opposite of the bottom one, okay? So if the bottom one has 4 minus I, then we're going to multiply not just the bottom, but also the top by 4 plus I. Because what you do to one part, you got to do to the other part, okay? So you're going to multiply by the opposite of what's on the bottom, but you're going to do it to both top and bottom, okay? So it's really like a 2-part 4 problem. We're just going to multiply the top, and then we're going to multiply the bottom. Now, if you would like to put it in parentheses to make it look kind of like your 4 problems, that's fine. But we're going to take the 4, and we're going to multiply it, and then we're going to take I and multiply it by into the second. So when we multiply by 4, 4 times 4 will give us 16. 4 times I would give us 4I. Multiply by I times 4 would give us 4I. And then I times I would give us I squared. And so I squared, we know it represents negative 1. So you got to make sure you remember that with all your I squares. So I want to continue and clean up my top. So go ahead and combine like terms. 16 minus 1 would give us 15. They're both whole numbers. And then our I numbers would be the 4I plus 4I, which would give us 8I. So that's your top. Now let's get the bottom. So on the bottom, we're going to multiply just the 4's together and the I's together, because the whole purpose of doing the conjugate is that the middle cancels out, okay? You don't have a middle. So you're going to just multiply 4 times 4, which would give us 16. And then negative I times I is a negative I squared. So keep in mind there's a negative 1 already in front of the I squared. So when you take that negative 1 and multiply it times another negative 1, that's going to make the whole thing just be a what? Plus 1. So 16 plus 1 would give us 17. Now you would look at your 15, your 8, and 17 and make sure that they have nothing in common, because you could divide off a GCF. But they don't. So that would be your answer. Now, if you look at on my labs, underneath it, the instructions are going to say to type your answer as integer or fractions. So fractions is kind of the hint that they want this to be 2 fractions. On the midterm, I had to go through and give credit for this answer, because the way the answers are typed in on the computer, that's not the wrong answer. It's just it wanted it in 2 separate fractions. So if you type it as 1 whole fraction, I will have to go through and give you credit for it, and I will. But my labs is going to want this as 2 separate fractions, which I hope you notice would be the same thing. 15 over 17 plus 8 over 17I is the exact same answer. But this is more of what my labs wants typed in. But they're the same exact answer. So I'll give credit for both. Okay. Number 4. It says solve by factoring 2n squared plus 5n plus 3 equals 0. So our rules for factoring says that it's a plus sign in the back, so we're adding to get 5 in the middle. So we're going to do our 2 parentheses, and our front number is 2, our back number is 3. So you really don't have any options but 1 factor pair apiece. 2 don't have but 1 factor, 1 and 2, and 3 don't have but 1 factor, 1 and 3. So you're going to place 2n and n in the front. And in the back, we're going to use 1 and 3, but make sure you put the 3 with the 2. I wouldn't put it across from 2, because if you multiply that, that's going to make 6. Because keep in mind, you always want to check your outside, inside, because that's what makes your middle. Outside, inside makes the middle. So 2n times n, 2n times 1 would give us 2n. And then 3 times n is just 3n. And we all know that 2 and 3 added together is 5. So that works. Now, 5 is positive. So if we're adding, everybody has the same sign. Plus, plus. Now, it's set equal to 0. So it might have said solve this by factoring, which you have factored it, but you have not solved for n. So now, take your 2 parentheses and set them to 0. Okay? That way you'll get your n number. Okay? So if you set the 2n plus 3 to 0, and you solve, you move 3 over, make it negative, divide by 2. So n is negative 3 over 2. And on the second one, you just subtract 1. So we get negative 3 over 2 and negative 1 as our answers. Now, my labs will already have a blank, and it's going to have them curly cues on it. So don't type in n equals, okay? Don't type in a parenthesis. Just simply place those 2 numbers in that blank. Does that make sense? Because it's going to say the solution set is, and it's already got the curly cues there for you. So you just place the numbers, but make sure you put them in there from the least to the greatest. So that would be negative 3 over 2, comma, negative 1. And that's how you would do your answer on my labs. Okay. Number 5, it says solve the equation by using the square root property. So we got z plus 6 squared, that's in parentheses squared, equals a negative 13. So we're just going to simply take the square root of both sides. That's going to leave us with z plus 6 equals plus or minus I square root of 13. Because 13 is prime. You can't take, it's not a perfect number in 13. So 13 itself has to stay inside the square root. Now, the negative must come out as an I, okay? So the last step you're going to do is get z by itself by moving 6. 6 is positive. So you're going to subtract 6 to the other side. So we got minus 6 plus or minus I square root of 13. And that's our answer. Number 6, we got y squared minus 8y equals negative 11. And so the instructions say use the quadratic formula to solve the equation. So if you're going to use the quadratic formula, first you need to make sure that all the numbers are on the same side. So that means this negative 11, you're going to move it over and make it positive. And when you're doing quadratic formula, you need to label so you know who's A, B, and C. A is going to be 1, B is negative 8, and C is a positive 11. So all of your formulas will be given to you. You got minus B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2 times A. So that's the quadratic formula. So we're going to plug in. It says minus the B number, who is negative 8, plus or minus the square root of B, who is negative 8 squared, minus 4 times A, who is 1, times C, who is an 11, all over 2 times A, who is 1. So on the front, the 2 negatives will make a positive 8, plus or minus. Negative 8 squared is positive 64. And you're going to multiply negative 4 times 11. That would give you a negative 44 all over 2 times 1, who is 2. Now, do not reduce 8 and 2 until the entire square root has been reduced. So we got 8 plus or minus the square root of 20 over 2. And we know the square root of 20 breaks down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. So that would give us 8 plus or minus square root of 4 is 2. Bring down the square root of 5 all over 2. And then all three numbers, talking about our triangle effect, you can divide by 2 on. So that would give us our final answer, which would be 4 plus or minus the square root of 5. Because the 2's reduce to 1's and they're not necessary to write. Okay. Number 7, you have 5x to the negative second power minus 29x to the negative first power plus 20 equals 0. So this takes us back to 1.6, our others section. And when we have negative exponents, now it's still in quadratic form, meaning my second exponent is half of that first one. So I'm going to factor it to get my 2 answers. But you need to remember, and this comes when you're studying. I would write this kind of stuff down. But when you have negative exponents, that means I got to flip my answers. I can factor it normally. But when I get to setting it to 0 to see what 2 numbers will make this thing 0 out, I got to flip it. Because this wasn't a normal quadratic equation. This got negatives as exponents. And that's what that means, that I got to flip my final answers. But you got to remember that. I'm going to factor it normally, okay? So I'm going to do my 2 parentheses. I have a plus sign back here, which means I'm adding to get 29. And my front number only has one factor. So I can only use 5 and 1 with x, 5x and 1x in the front. Now 20 on the other hand, 20 you got 1 and 20, 2 and 10, and 4 and 5, okay? So the 2 numbers I'm going to use are going to be 4 and 5 because in my head I'm already multiplying my outside, inside. 5 times 5 will make us, what, 25 there? And 4 times x is just 4, and that will add up to 29. 25 plus 4 is 29. So that works because that's what's in the middle. Now, be very mindful. Take your time, check your FOIL, check your factoring. Make sure you know that when you're adding, you got to have the same sign. And 29 is negative. So that means both of them are going to be negative. That's important because if you put the wrong numbers in there, or just the wrong signs, you're going to give me the wrong 2 answers, okay? And that makes a difference when I'm asking you for the answers, okay? So we're going to set it to 0. When it's set to 0, we got to find the 2 answers. So if this was normal, a regular quadratic, we'll do all this good work and we get x is 4/5. That's the normal answer. This is not because it's negative. So this is where I got to stay on my A game, that I'm going to remember I got to flip that. Not change the sign, but flip it. So the right answer to this would be positive 5/4. That's what I mean by flipping. I must flip that answer. Same thing on the second one. You got x minus 5 equals 0. If this was a normal problem, the answer would be 5. But because it had those negative exponents, you got to remember to flip 5. And so you got to remember that all whole numbers technically sit on top of who? 1. So if I flip that, that's 1/5. Okay? So I got 5/4 and 1/5. And again, my labs will have the 2 curly Q's in a space. So you would put those 2 answers in those curly Q's, and you make sure you put them in there like that. Okay? 4/5 is bigger. Yeah, I see that. Now, if you don't remember, then you might want to write these -1s on your X. So you'll be reminded to flip. But you can factor it as normal. Does that make? I want to make sure I say that you can factor it as normal, but you got to remember to flip your answers. Okay? Questions? All right. Number 8. It says solve the equation, and you got the square root of x plus 7, and then we got plus 5 equals x. Now, I can show you how to solve it to remind you, but when you're going to be given multiple choice answers on this one, then I would just simply plug it in. Because even if you solve it, you still got to plug it in and check it, all right? So the answer choices that they give are going to be 9, 2 and 9, 2, and 9 and 18. So 9 is down there a couple times, so I would try 9. Plug it in. See what 9 would give you. Okay? So if you plug 9 in both places for x, 9 plus 7 would give us 16 under the square root. And so the square root of 16 is 4. Is 4 plus 5 9? Yes. So this checks. So 9 works, all right? So that kind of puts me with what? 9. That's A, B, and C. A, B, and D all have a 9 in it, right? Okay. Now, this is my logic. 9 I know works. So the answer that just has 2 by itself does not work. Which that kind of leads me to believe if 2 is stuck with 9, then that one don't work either because it's got to have 9 with it. Does that make sense? But if you don't see that logic, go ahead and try 2 so you can rule it out. But if you try 2, 2 plus 7 plus 5 has to equal 2. Well, 2 plus 7 is under the square root, so that's a 9. Square root of 9 is 3, and it's 3 plus 5, 2. No. So that does not work. So yes, you know B and C don't work. So the only other thing you would try would be what, 18? To see if it would work. So 18 plus 7 under the square root plus 5 has to equal 18. So 18 plus 7 is what, 25? Square root of 25 is 5. Is 5 plus 5 18? No. So 9 and 18 don't work, so the only answer would be 9. Okay, now that's just checking the answer choices. Now I will show, for those that want to see or be reminded of how to work the problem. We got x plus 7 plus 5 equals x. So first off, you got to get this square root on the side by itself. So you must move 5. And when I move it, I subtract it. And so once you have that square root by itself, then you can square both sides. Because that's what get rid of the square root is doing, is inverse, which is squaring it. So that's going to leave us with x plus 7 on the left, but this means you have that parenthesis twice. So that's going to be a complete foil, which would give us x squared minus 5x plus 25. That's the complete foil multiplying x by both of them in the second, negative 5 by both of them in the second. So when you clean it up, you can combine. That would give us x squared minus 10x plus 25. And since we got an x squared, you remember when we talked about this means we're going to factor. So that means that this x plus 7 needs to move over and be with all the other stuff. You can't factor this unless everybody's on the same side. So that means I'm going to set this to 0. I got x squared minus 10x minus x when I bring him over. Bring down my plus 25 minus 7 when I bring him over. Okay? So we're going to do combine like terms, x squared minus 11x, and then 25 minus 7 will give us a positive, what would it be, 16? Or 19? I mean 18. Somebody check behind me. I think it's 16. It's 18? Okay, I knew it's like check behind me. 18. So we're going to factor. We're adding to get 11. So that's going to give us x and x, 9 and 2. And then they're both going to be negative because 11 is negative. So that's where you see that x is 9 and x is 2. But even though you do all of this, you still got to do what with 9 and 2? Check it. Yes, and that's the point. So we've already checked the 9 and it works, and we checked 2 and it doesn't work. So that gives you your further proof that it's got to be just A. Does that make sense? But that would be the actual work if you were working it. Okay? Questions? All right, number 9. It says solve, and you got 12 over x squared minus 4 minus 3 over x minus 2 equals 6 over x plus 2. So this is our rational equations. We talked about these. You're solving for x, but x is on the bottom of a fraction. So you got to be careful that when you solve for x, you don't get a number that's going to zero it out. Because if you do, then that number can't work. So I would hope that you see, because we're going to need to get common denominator. You got x squared minus 4, x minus 2, and x plus 2. The x squared minus 4 is the difference of squares, which is really both of those other two denominators. Does that make sense? If you factored that, you would get x plus 2 and x minus 2. So I need a common denominator because that's what you're going to use to clear out these fractions, which would obviously be both denominators. You got to have the x plus 2 and you got to have the x minus 2. That's what's on the bottom of all of them, okay? One or the other or both. Then, when we did these problems, I had you to write what x could not equal. So you would be mindful if you wrote it, you would be like, okay, I just wrote that it can't equal that number if I was to get that number. So I would hope that you see that it can't be -2 and it can't be +2. Because if you get a -2 or a +2, you're going to get a 0 in your denominator. And that can't happen. So you're going to multiply each term by that LCD. So if you need to write it at the top of each one, that's fine. But you do know the one that's going to be multiplied by the top number is the one that's not the denominator. The one that is the denominator cancels out. So that's what I want you to see when we go through the multiply. So on this first one, the plus 2 and the minus 2 cancel. So I'm just left with 12. You're not multiplying anything by 12. Does that make sense? Bring down my minus 3. The x minus 2 cancels. So what is left would be the x plus 2. I got to multiply by negative 3. Equals, on the last one, the x plus 2 cancels. So I'm left with 6 times x minus 2. Do y'all see that? And we talked about this. So that's how you would clear out when you have denominators of a binomial. So we're going to just solve it like a regular equation. We're going to do our distributive property. Watch your signs. And that would give us 12 minus 3x minus 6 equals 6x minus 12. Combine like terms. I can combine that 12 minus 6. So I got negative 3x plus 6 equals 6x minus 12. Put your x's together, whole numbers together. So negative 3x minus 6x equals negative 12 minus 6. Negative 3x minus 6x is a negative 9x. Negative 12 minus 6 is negative 18. Divide by negative 2. X is positive 2. So that was my whole purpose of writing this. So you'll be minded that can you have 2 for x? No. So this is considered a no solution, or what my labs calls an empty set. That's going to be the wording that you see on my labs. Because 2 can't work. 2 would end up making the first one turn to a 0 and the middle one turn to a 0. And that can't happen. Okay? Questions? Okay. Number 10. You got your inequalities is what I'm getting ready to work. So you were given a linear, a quadratic, and a rational inequality, and absolute value inequality. So you got one of each, okay? So the first one would be your linear. On number 10, we got 4 times x plus 2, in parentheses, plus 4 is greater than or equal to 8 plus 5x. So we're going to distribute, and that would give us 4x plus 8 plus 4 is greater than or equal to 8 plus 5x. So I'm going to combine like terms. I got 4x plus 12 is greater than or equal to 8 plus 5x. So bring your variables together. 4x minus 5x is greater than or equal to 8 minus 12. So that would give me a negative x is greater than or equal to negative 4. Now you got to be minded that if you have a negative on x, you got to divide by negative 1, but you also have to do what? Flip good that inequality sign. You cannot divide by negative and keep the same sign. You got to flip that, okay? So be mindful that you must flip, and that's because you're dividing by negative. So that's going to give us x is less than or equal to positive 4. Now the answer that my labs wants they want you to plug in the interval notation. So you're not picking a number line. They're wanting you to actually give that interval notation. So if you need to draw the number line to help get your notation right, that's fine. So if it's pointing to the left, that stands for less. You know your shade is everything that's smaller than 4. And then we're going to have a bracket open at 4 towards my shade. So the interval would match this if your shade comes first, would obviously be negative infinity. Okay, negative infinity has nothing to do with the numbers being positive or negative. It's the fact that if I keep walking to the left, I'm going to hit all negative numbers. Okay, so we got negative infinity to 4, and you have a parenthesis on your negative infinity and a bracket on 4. So this is the interval that they're wanting you to type in the computer. Now on the midterm, I did have some students to type this in, and it took off because that's not what it wanted. It wanted the interval. So if you type in X and the symbol, it's going to count off. You got to type the interval in, okay? That's with your bracket versus parenthesis, the number, or the infinity sign, okay? In this case, it's a negative infinity in the front. Questions? Okay. The second is number 11 type of inequality you're going to have is the quadratic. So we got x squared minus 2x minus 8 is greater than 0. So if you remember, we got to factor this to get our two numbers. So we are subtracting to get 2. In the front, you got x and x. And I would hope that you would know from 8, we're going to use 4 and 2. Because 4 minus 2 is also 2. Now, your outside, inside, that's a 2x and a 4x. And it does give us 2x, but 2x is negative. So make sure you know that the 4x has to carry that negative in order for you to have a negative 2x, okay? So make sure you have a negative on the 4x and a positive on the 2. That's very, very important that you watch your signs, okay? Because you'll give me the wrong two numbers. Now, what we did when we talked about our quadratics, we set both of the parentheses to 0. And you get x is greater than 4, and you get x is greater than a negative 2. Now, the problem with this is that your sign is pointing in the same direction. And this is where we tested our number line, if y'all remember. Negative 2 will come before 4. And I told you I like to test 0 because it's an easy plug-in. So if I plug 0 into the original, where x is, you would get, your x part cancels out, and you would get negative 8 is greater than 0. And you would say, okay, is that a true statement or a false statement? Well, that's a false statement. No negative number is bigger than 0. So that means my answer is not in the middle, but on the outside. Because they work together, the problems that I gave you, okay? So that would be the type of shade you would have. Now, the symbols that go on both negative 2 and 4 would be a parenthesis because you do not have an equal bar under your sign. Now, this is known as a split notation. So when you're writing that interval, you're going to say, okay, it starts from negative infinity, stopping at negative 2, and that's in parentheses. And I put a U, that union sign, and there's an actual union symbol on the computer. Don't type capital U in the keyboard. Okay, make sure y'all use the actual symbol. And then it's going to pick back up with parenthesis 4 to positive infinity. it's going to ask you to put that interval in the blank. And so that's the interval notation that it's looking for, okay? Now, if you remember when I taught this, I told you with the quadratics that if you have a greater than sign, that's going to give you an outside shading. If you have a less than sign, it's going to be a middle shading, meaning it should be true in the middle. So if you remember that, that will help when you're doing your shade to get your interval. Okay? And you don't even have to think, go with the whole test in the number line, because that will work on the problems that you'll have on the final. Okay? Number 12, you have your rational inequality, which is x minus 4 over x plus 6, which is less than or equal to 0. Now, when I went over rational inequalities, I told you that they put this one on the exam on purpose for you to miss it. Because sometimes we're not going to work it so fast. It is so simple to easily mess it up, okay? Now, when you have a rational, and it's an easier one because it's already set at 0, you're going to simply just take the top and set it to the inequality, and the bottom and set it to the inequality. So when you do that, you get x is less than or equal to 4, and x is less than or equal to negative 6. Now, when you are solving these, you're trying to figure out what x could be in that rational inequality. Since they gave you a less than or equal to symbol, that makes this problem dangerous, because you cannot let both the top and bottom equal 0. Okay? Meaning, I can't let it be a number that's going to give me a 0. Now, the top is okay. 0 on top of any fraction is just 0. That ain't your issue. Your issue is the bottom. Do you see that you have x can be less than or equal to negative 6? That's not true, because you can't let x equal negative 6. It can be less than negative 6, but it can't equal negative 6 on the dot, because if you let that be negative 6, negative 6 plus 6 is who? 0. And you can't have a 0 on the bottom of a fraction. So you're going to have to be reminded that when you're doing this one, you're going to have to know that I can only do less than 6. I can't let it less than negative 6. I can't let it equal negative 6. So that's going to make a difference in me using a bracket versus a parenthesis. And that little slight difference is what students are going to miss. They're going to automatically stick a bracket on both of these numbers, and it's going to count it wrong, because negative 6 can't have 1, because it can't equal negative 6. So when you're doing your number line and you got negative 6 and 4, now my whole spiel about this thing being less than will let us know this should be a middle shade. Okay, that should work. It should be a middle shade. But if you wanted to test 0, it would test your middle. So if you plug the 0 in for those two x's, you're going to get negative 4 over 6. Is that less than 0? Yes. Any negative number is less than 0. So this is true. So this is where my shade would be, is in between them. But the issue is going to be bracket versus parenthesis. Negative 6 must have a parenthesis on it, and 4 carries the bracket. So your interval notation would be parenthesis negative 6, comma 4, bracket. And that's what students will miss. And I'm telling you, I might have 1 or 2 students out of every class that remember that. So it's very likely to miss. I don't want you to miss it, but because a lot of times you're studying and you're not remembering every little detail about each one of these problems, that could easily happen. But I want y'all to get it right. The bottom one has to have a parenthesis on it. Okay? $13 is your absolute value inequality. So we got 4x plus 3, an absolute value. Then it has a minus 13 is less than negative 2. So keep in mind what I normally see with the absolute value problems is students forget that they got to work two problems. You got to work two. Now, you first got to get the absolute value by itself before you can split it into the two separate problems. So that means I got to get rid of negative 13. You cannot work this with negative 13 sitting right there. So if it's minus, you're going to add it to the other side. So that's going to leave me with my absolute value is less than positive 11. Now I can split this, okay? You got to tell me what would give me an 11 in those bars. And if you also know negative 11 in them bars will also be 11. So that's the whole, I got to get two problems. One's going to be at 11 and the other one is at negative 11. Now, since this is an inequality, the rule says not only do you change it to a negative, but you got to flip that sign, okay? So our two problems without the bars are going to be 4x plus 3 is less than 11. And then 4x plus 3 is greater than negative 11. You must remember for the second one, you got to flip and change. Flip that sign, change that number. Okay? Flip and change. So you're going to work these two simple inequalities. We got 4x is less than 11 minus 3. 11 minus 3 is 8. Divide by 4. X is less than what? 2. On the second one, you're going to subtract 3. And that will give us, what, a negative 14. Same sign we're going to add. Divide by 4. X is greater than a negative 7 over 2. Make sure you reduce negative 14 over 4. That can be reduced by 2. So you got to type in the interval notation. So if you did your number line to see exactly what your shade would be. Now this sign, and it works on these too now, it's less than. So you should be in the what? Middle. Okay? But this one is not a test because your symbols are not pointing in the same direction. So really, you're just shading where it tells you to shade on the absolute value. Now, if they are meeting in the same place, then you only show that meeting place. So if you look at it, it says x is less than 2. That would be coming to the left of 2. And it says x is greater than negative 7 over 2. That's going to the right of 2. Negative 7 over 2, I mean. So they both would be in the middle at the same time. So that's the reason why we just shade the middle. So the symbol on both is going to be parentheses because there's no equal bars under your inequality sign. So your actual answer, I'm going to write it here, is negative 7 over 2, comma 2 in parentheses. Yes, it up. Okay. Number 14, it asks you to find the distance and the midpoint with 2 points. We got negative 311 and 2, negative 8. So if we're going to find the distance, and you'll have all your formulas, the distance formula says you're going to take your x's, subtract them, square them, plus the subtraction of your y squared, and then take the square root. So we're going to plug in for our x's. We have negative 3 minus 2 squared, plus our y's would be 11. Oh, that's a negative 11, my bad. Negative 11 minus a negative 8 makes it a plus 8 squared. So negative 3 minus 2 is negative 5 squared. And then negative 11 plus 8 is a negative 3 squared. So that would give us 25 plus 9. And keep in mind, you're squaring this stuff to keep it positive. So 25 plus 9 would give you 34 under the square root of 34 is the difference. And there's not a perfect number in 34, so you're going to leave it as the square root of 34. That's your distance. And we're going to take the same 2 points, and we're going to find the midpoint. Well, the midpoint formula, it says you're going to take those same 2 x's, add them up, and divide by 2, and take your y's and add them up and divide by 2. So if we take our x's of negative 3 plus 2 over 2, and our y's are negative 11 plus a negative 8 over 2. Well, negative 3 plus 2 is a negative 1 over 2. And we're going to keep it in fraction form. And then negative 11 minus a negative, plus a negative 8, you're going to add them up because they're the same sign. And that's the negative 19 over 2. So they did not reduce down evenly, so keep them in fraction form. Negative 1/2, comma, negative 19/2. And you would keep it in parentheses when you put it in my labs because it's an ordered pair. So it must be in parentheses. Questions? Number 15, it says find the center radius form of the equation of the circle, describe, and they want you to graph it. So the center is negative 2, 0, and it has a radius of 4. So the center radius form, and you'll see this equation on your formula sheet. That's for circles. So H and K, we know represented the center. H and K represent the center. And it is the opposite when it's in parentheses. So whatever your center is, it's going to be the opposite when you stick it in there with X or Y. So if we're doing the X, it was minus 2, then you're going to have in parentheses X plus 2 squared. Keep in mind it has to be the opposite sign. Now our Y is 0, so it's no point in me putting Y plus 0 squared or Y minus 0 squared because 0 is neither positive or negative. So we're just going to say Y squared. Equals, the radius is 4. So you see that says R squared. So that would be 4 squared, which is 16. So that would be your equation in center radius form. Now, it asks that you graph it as well. And you do know that MyLabs has a graphing tool. So all you need to do is plot the point for negative 2, 0. Okay, you're going to plot that point. And you're going to select the circle graphing tool. And you're going to go over 4 lines and put a dot. And the computer itself will make the actual circle. Does that make sense? But all you're going to do is take the radius, which is 4, go over 4 lines. And that's where you put your next dot, and it will connect it itself. Okay? Questions? Okay. Then you also have a circle that's in the general form that they want you to find the center and the radius for. And so it's x squared plus y squared minus 6x plus 2y equals -9. So if you remember when we was in the general form, we have to do completing a square to get the center and the radius. So we're going to group our x's together and group our y's together. And I use bubbles, but you can use spaces, okay? But I'm going to say x squared minus 6x and a bubble or a space because I need to put a number there. Do the same thing with your y's. Y squared plus 2y and a bubble equals -9 and 2 bubbles. Because if you got 2 bubbles on the left side, you need 2 bubbles on the right side. So keep in mind, we're going to be dealing with the middle terms for the x and for the y. So you're going to not take any signs with it because all of our bubbles are positive. But you're going to say half of the middle and then square it. So we're looking at 6. Half of 6 is 3. 3 squared, 3 to the second power is 9. So you're putting +9 on both sides. Do the same thing with 2. Half of 2 is 1. 1 squared is still 1. So you put +1 on both sides. So we're going to do a parenthesis squared for both the x and the y. And I would check this number first, just to make sure you get an actual number, a positive number. And -9 plus 9 plus 1 would give us +1, okay? So you have an actual circle. So we're going to put the factor form of each, the x and the y, in the parentheses. But if you don't see that, you know you're going to put the same sign, same letter, same sign, and half of 6 or the square root of 9, which is 3. Same thing for your y. You're going to put the same letter, same sign, that's positive, and then either half of 2 or the square root of 1, which is still 1. So in this form, you should be able to give me that center and that radius. So the center is going to be +3, -1. Keep in mind, you take the opposite. And the square root of 1 is just 1. So this is a circle, and it has a center and an actual radius. Now keep in mind, if this last number was 0, then your answer would be just a what? Point. All right? If that last number would have been -4 or any negative, -1, then your answer is not a circle, but it's non-existent, okay? Non-existent, and that's one word, but I couldn't get it up there together. Non-existent. And y'all do remember we talked about that. If you get a negative, it's non-existent. But if you get a number, you can actually give me the center and the radius. But if you get 0, it's just a point. Okay? (17) Find the slope of the line containing the pair of points. So this is asking you for slope. So the slope says that you're going to subtract your y's over your x's. And so the point given, the 2 points, are -6, +5, and -1, +8. So to find that slope, we're going to say 5 minus 8 over -6 minus a -1. That's a +1. So make sure y'all watch that sign there. So that's going to give us a -3 on top, and -6 plus 1 is -5. And the two negatives make that turn into a +3/5. And that's your slope. Okay. 18 says write the equation of a line. They might ask for it in slope-intercept form. They could ask for it in standard. I'm going to show you both that are going to pass through the point 29 and it's perpendicular to the equation 3x plus 5y equals 1. So I want to know what line is going to hit this point, but it's going to be perpendicular. That means it's going to cross this other line at a 90-degree angle. So what I need from that line is its actual slope, okay? I need to see the slope. So when you're in standard form, you can find the slope by doing minus a over b. Minus a over b. Keep in mind that this is standard form, so a would be the number on x, b is the number that's on y, c is your constant. So if I do minus the a number, that would be -3 over the b number, which is 5. So the slope of this line right there, is -3/5. Now, I don't want parallel. If you would have had parallel, you would use the exact same slope as that line, okay? Parallel would mean, okay, I would use -3/5. But this says perpendicular. So the perpendicular slope means opposite reciprocal, opposite sign and flip. So if he's negative, you're going to have a positive. If that's 3 over 5, you're going to use 5 over 3. This is the slope that you would use, okay? Now, once you have the slope and we got a point, we're going to use slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b, to find our b so we can write this equation. So our y is going to be 9. Our m is 5 over 3. Our x is 2 plus b. So that's going to give us 9 equals, this will be 10/3. Do y'all see that? It does not reduce down to a whole number. 5 times 2 is 10 over 3. But we can still work with it. Y'all got calculators. You can subtract your 10/3 because we got to get b by itself. And so in your calculator, you would type in 9 minus ABC 10. 9 minus 10 ABC 3. And that should give you 17. Or if we're doing it manually, 3 times 9 is 27. So I know that 9 is the same as 27/3. So 27 minus 10, yeah, is 17/3. So our equation that is perpendicular to this line in slope-intercept form would be y equals 5/3 x plus 17/3. That would be my answer in slope-intercept form, okay? Now, if they ask us to write it in standard, this is slope-intercept. If they ask you to write your answer in standard form, y equals 5/3 x plus 17/3, then the first thing you got to remember about standard form is that one, doesn't do fractions, and two, you can't have a negative x. So that means I would need to multiply everybody by the common denominator. In this case, it's the same number, which is just 3. So that would give us a 3y equals 5x plus 17. Then next, you're going to move 5x over and make it negative. And then you notice, oh, I can't have a negative on my x when I'm in standard form. So you're going to divide by -1, which simply just means change everyone's sign. Okay, that's what that means. Change everyone's sign. So we got a positive 5x, a negative 3y, and now we got a negative 17. That would be my same equation in standard form. So I don't know. It varies per class. Y'all might say do it in slope intercept. It could say do it in standard. So I want to make sure I have showed you that we talked about this. We want to refresh you on going from slope intercept to standard form. Okay? All right. Next, number 19. It says decide whether the given relation defines y as a function of x and give the domain and range. So this is asking, is this a function? Y equals the square root of 8x plus 1. Now, when we talked about functions, I told you, okay, x got to be in control for it to be a function. That means whatever we're talking about, if it's a square root, a line, exponents, a fraction, all of it has to be on the side with x for x to be in control. You can't tell me nothing about y until you plug into x first. So is this a function? Yes, this is a function. Okay? Yes, x is in control. So this is a function. Now, give me the domain and the range. Well, we talked about this. This is square root. So the biggest thing about square roots is you got to keep it positive because you can't take the square root of a negative. That gives us imaginary numbers. So to keep it real numbers, it's got to stay positive. So when you set your inside to 0, you're going to get the starting point of where this thing is going to start to zero out at. And at 0, that's where you're going positive. So if you can't see it, you're going to take it and set it to 0, and you're going to get a negative 1/8. So that's the starting point. I can't have any numbers less than that number. Everything bigger than that number is going to work. So my domain is going to be from -1/8 to positive infinity. And you do put a bracket on -1/8 because I want to include it. I need it to zero out. Now the range is going to be from 0 to positive infinity because it's a square root. And it's got to stay positive. You're not going to get any negative numbers from under that. That square root is not going to produce anything that's in the negative part of the y. So that has to start at 0. Keep in mind, this interval represents everything that's positive, all positive, when you start at 0 and go to positive infinity. So that's the outcome, because that means y, that means x. So my outcome is going to be all positive numbers, okay? Twenty is another one that asks if this is the function. y equals 6 over x minus 4. And this is a fraction. X is on the side with x. So yes, this is a function. Okay, yes, it's a function. So they also on this one want you to give the domain and the range. Now, we talked about this. X is domain. So X is on the bottom of a fraction. So I have to be mindful that I got to be careful what X equals. Now, I don't care about it being negative. You can have a negative fraction. You can have a negative on the bottom. You just got to move it to the top or the side. But I cannot let my bottom zero out. So I have to see, okay, what would give me a 0? Positive 4. Positive 4 is the number that I cannot let X equal. It can be everybody else but 4. It can be any negative number. It can be any positive number. It just can't be 4. Because 4 makes that turn into a 0. 4 minus 4 is 0. So this is that domain that we talked about that has a split notation. You're going to say, okay, we can go any negative number. So I'm going all the way negative infinity, any negative number, all the way up to 4, and it's in parentheses because I cannot put a bracket on 4 because that bracket would mean I'm allowing it to equal 4, and I can't. Skip over 4, union, pick it back up at 4, and go to positive infinity. So in other words, I can let X be 3.999. That's getting as close to 4 on the left side. And then it's got to skip 4 and pick back up at 4.0000001. It can't be 4 on the dot though, right? Now the range, sometimes it's harder for students to see what you would get out of this, your outcome. But if I let my X be negative numbers, I'm going to have a whole negative fraction. So that means I could possibly get any negative number. I can also get any positive number. But your top is never going to reduce to 0 because there's no X up there. 6, the lowest you can reduce 6 to is a 1. But 6 is not going to change to a 0. So my range is going to look very similar. You can let it be any negative number up to 0, skipping 0, and going from 0 to positive infinity. That split notation is letting us know that it can be everything but 0. That top is not going to reduce down to 0. Okay. 21. You got some composition functions. It says let's let f of x equal 2x minus 1 and h of x equal x minus 5. And we're going to do h of f of 6. H of f of 6. Now, that's a composition function. So that means you're only going to plug 6 into the function closest to him, which is the f function. You do not plug 6 into both functions, just f. So we're going to go to f's function, which is 2x minus 1. You're going to stick 6 in the place of x. That gives us 12. 12 minus 1 is 11. Now you're going to take 11 and you're going to plug it into the h function. Okay? So h function is x minus 5. So 11 minus 5 is who? 6. And that's your final answer. Okay? That's the composition function. All right, 22. It wants you to compute and simplify the difference quotient of f of x plus h minus f of x all over h, and your f of x function is 6x minus 5. Now, I can show you the whole plug-in, but it's multiple choice. So the answer that they're trying to prove is the coefficient, when it's in linear, the coefficient that's on x. So the answer you're trying to get is 6. So that's all the answer to this one is. But if you want to see the f of x plus h minus f of x all over h, you're going to take your function, and in the place of x, you're going to plug in x plus h. And you're going to do distributive property. And that's what you get for that part. And then the second part says minus your original function, which is 6x minus 5. So that means you're going to have to do distributive property with that negative. So we still got 6x plus 6h minus 5. That would give us a minus x and a plus 5. Now at this point, some stuff's supposed to cancel. If not, you did it wrong. So my x's cancel and my 5's cancel. So I'm left with 6h. So the last thing you are to do is divide this thing by h, and it divides the h off. Therefore, you left with 6. So that's what you're doing. It's kind of a proof to show how you get that coefficient, but your answer has got to be 6. So you really don't have to show that because this is going to be multiple choice, okay? #23 says in the following exercise, find the coordinates of the vertex. So we're finding the vertex. And we got f of x equals 4x squared plus 16x plus 5. So if you remember, this is getting closer to the last step. This is in chapter 3. But if we're finding the vertex, then we're going to do minus b over 2a to get the x part. Okay? We're going to do minus b over 2a to get the x part. And keep in mind, this is quadratic form. Okay? So it would be ABC from left to right. So if we plugged in minus 16 over 2 times 4, that would be negative 16 over 8, which will reduce to a negative 2. So that's the x part of your vertex. Now, to find the y, you're going to just simply take negative 2 and plug it in for x. So if you're doing, I would type this in the calculator so you won't worry about your order of operations. But you would do your exponent first. That would give me 4, and 4 times 4 would make that 16. 16 minus 32 plus 5, that would give me a negative 16 plus 5, which will end up being negative what? 11. So your vertex is negative 2, negative 11 for that parabola. All right. 24. It wants you to take this polynomial, 15x to the third plus 361x squared minus 347x plus 75. And so it wants you to find all of the possible rational zeros. And then that's our box. and then find the answers, and then factor form for the answers, okay? So, we did our box of our possible rational zeros. You know, this is what, P over Q? So our P would represent 75 and our Q would represent 15. So our Q would be 1, positive, negative, 1, 3, 5, and 15. I wrote that out of order. And our P's would be positive, negative, 1, 3, 5, 15, 25, and 75. That's positive and negative. Okay? So if you're going to put all of your P's on top of your Q's, you're going to have some stuff in common. So you want to make sure you got them in the lowest form. And you got plus or minus on every one of these numbers, okay? So we do know our tops, our whole numbers, are going to be 1, 3, 5, 15, 25, and 75. And I'm just going to go straight down my Q's. If I put 3 on the bottom, then I can write 1/3. I don't need 3 over 3. I don't need 5 over 3. I don't need 15 over 3. I can do 25 over 3. And I don't need 75 over 3. They reduce, okay? Then I go to 5 being on the bottom, and I can do 1/5, 3/5, but I wouldn't do 5, 15, 25, or 75. And then last is going to be 15 on the bottom, and I can do 1 over 15, but I wouldn't do 3 over 15, 5 over 15, 15 over 15, 25 over 15, or 75 over 15. So your possible zeros would be those numbers, okay? Now, finding one that works, you're going to do your synthetic division, or I would just simply take the number and plug it in to see which one works and use that number to get to my second degree, okay? Get me a calculator for these big numbers. All right, so let's use 1/3 because I kind of know it's supposed to work for time's sake. So we're going to multiply by 1/3, which if you're doing it manually, you're going to be dividing by 3. So 15 divided by 3 will give us 5. And you're going to add 361 plus 5 would give us 366. Divided by 3 would give me 122. You're going to add that to a negative 347, and that would give us a negative 225. And then 225 divided by 3 would give me a negative 75, which is 0. So that would put us at 15x squared plus 366 minus 225 equals 0. And let me see. So we can take off what, a 3? And that would give us 5x squared plus 122x minus 75. Ooh. And we're subtracting. So we're going to factor. In the front, I got 5x and x. And I'm trying to subtract and get 122. So with 75, I'm going to use 3 and 25. And so 25 times 5 gives me 125 minus 3. Yeah, it's 122. So that will work. So that's going to mean that this one is going to be positive and this is going to be negative. Or they chose some big numbers to use. So my other two answers would be a positive 3/5 and a negative 25. Y'all see that? So our three answers would be negative 25, 3/5, and a 1/3. And I wrote those out of order. But those would be your three answers, okay?
Question. Whenever we plug it into the computer, if it's out of order, will it count it off?
Yes, it might. Let me see what the instructions say. Because they supposed to tell you to write it in order. It just says factory completely. They might not count off because it does not say that. But normally in the curly cues, they do want you to write it in order. Okay? And then it's going to ask you for the factor form. Well, you already got two of them right here. So to write 1/3 as a factor, that would just simply be 3x minus 1. Okay? So the factor forms is what I'm going to put in the red box for your answers. Okay, your answer will actually be negative 25, 1/3, and 3/5. But in factor form, you would have 3x minus 1 and 5x minus 3 and x plus 25. Okay? Questions. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7, 8, and it's not long, but I got 8 more problems. I'm going to keep working. If you want to stay on, you can. If you got to go, you can log off when I'm at my time, but I do want to say that I did try to get them all worked, so I'm going to keep going working. The last ones don't go as slow. They're quicker. It says on 25, which is not a possible rational zero. You want your calculator. Which is not a possible rational zero of the polynomial 3x to the third plus 32x squared plus 32x plus 27. And it's giving you some answer choices. So it has like 1/9, a 1, a 3, and a negative 1/3. So this is kind of seeing if you remember your P over Q setup. I don't want to know which one of these work and don't work. I need to know who's not even in my box, who's not a possible zero, period. Okay? So if you look at your Q's, you can only have a 1 and a 3 on the bottom. So that right there, with me saying that, keep in mind your setup is P over Q. My Q's in this instance is nothing but 1 and 3. So that means you either got whole numbers or you got numbers that got 3 on the bottom. So with me saying that, who is automatically not a zero? A. This one is going to be your answer. That's not a zero, because it simply has a 9 on the bottom. And that 9 is not a Q. 9 is a P. It ain't a Q. So they're trying to confuse you, but you got to remember it's P over Q. And kind of look at your bottom numbers. That's all you can have is a 3 on the bottom. So the rest, B, C, and D, would be possible answers, okay? 26. it says, if you have the polynomial 2x to the third plus 3x squared minus 50x plus 24, and it says k equals 4. It says factor into linear factors given that k is a 0. So they gave you a help. They've given you your start. So all you're going to do is use your 4 to break this thing down, and so you can see your other factors, okay? So I'm going to plug 4 in to my synthetic, and that's going to give us 8, and then 8 plus 3 would give us 11. 11 times 4 would give us 44. 44 minus 50 would give us negative 6, and negative 6 times 4 would give me negative 24, which is 0. So if you factored this, you would have 2x squared plus 11x minus 6. And so to get your other factors already in linear form now, you are subtracting to get 11. In the front, I can only use 2x and x. With 6, you got 1 and 6 and 2 and 3. And you're trying to subtract to get an 11. So what we're going to use 6 and 1. But keep in mind, 6 can't be in the same parentheses with 2. And if you checked yourself, that would give me 12 on the outside, 1 on the inside, which will subtract an 11. So my 11 is positive. That means I got to have a positive 12. That's with my 6. So your other two linear forms for your answers are going to be 2x minus 1 and x plus 6. But you're going to also have to put the linear form for 4. That was on the midterm where people missed. They gave me these two and didn't give me the one that was given to them. So you got to also put x minus 4, because that would be the linear factor for all answers to that polynomial. Does that make sense? So don't forget to do the linear factor of the k that they gave you. Okay, so it has to be all 3 of them to get credit. 27, it says use the synthetic division and factor theorem to determine another factor given that x plus 4 is one of your factors. So this is really, they're giving you help. They're saying this is one of your answers, but they want you to find the other factor form for 6x to the third plus 25x squared plus 3x minus 4. And they give you some answer choices. So you could either take the answer choices and plug them in, or you can use the factor form and plug that opposite number in. If you use the factor form, you know that's a negative 4 as far as the answer. So we got 6, 25, 3, and a negative 4. So that would give us a negative 24, which is 1. And that would give me negative 4, a negative 1, a positive 4, and 0. So that would bring us to 6x squared plus 1x minus 1 equals 0. So if you factored this, you would have 2x and 3x and 1 and 1, because I'm subtracting to get the 1 in the middle. So between 2x and 3x, because that's what you got, 2x and 3x, to get that 1x, the 1 is positive. I need a positive 3 and a negative 1. So the next, if you had some choices, because it does give some choices on what would be the next or the other answer to this, then obviously the answer would be the 3x minus 1. That's the other ones are not the answer. 28, we're almost at the end. It says solve the equation, and you got 16 to the 3x minus 6 power. Squash that. Let's do 9 to the 3x minus 1 power equals 81 to the x plus 2 power. So this is our exponential functions. So you need to write them in the same base. And we talked about that. So I'm going to write them in bases of 9. And I'm going to keep my exponent on the one that is already at 9. And on the one that is 81, I would need to raise it to the second power in order to get 81. And then I bring that original exponent down. Once you have the same base, you just set the exponents equal to one another to solve. So 3x minus 1 will equal 2x plus 4. Keep in mind you're going to distribute. And then you're going to just solve. 3x minus 2x is going to equal 4 plus 1. So x is just 5. $29. It says find the inverse function of 4x plus 2. So if you remember, we know f of x just means y. And in order to find the inverse, you're going to switch places with x and y. So that means you're going to have x equals 4y plus 2. And you're going to solve for y in its new spot. So you're going to subtract 2 from x. And then you're going to divide everybody by 4. So that's going to give us 1 over 4x minus 1/2 equals y. That would be our inverse. Okay, 30 says write in logarithmic form. Okay, so this is not, it's not nothing for you to solve. They want you to take this exponential form and write it in logarithmic form. So to do that, you're going to have log. Your base number is the subscript number. And you got to put a number here equals a number here. So the 216 would go in that blank, and the exponent of 3 would go in the blank on the right side of the equal sign. And that would be the correct way to write that as a log. And then 31 actually wants you to solve the log function. So I would set it up as an exponential function, which would be 5 to the x power equals 125. So in other words, I'm asking you, what power would I need to raise 5 to in order to get 125? Well, obviously that would just be the third. 5 to the third power is 125. Okay, so your x is just 3. And the last type of problem we looked at, this is the last one on the review, was the system of linear equations. 8x plus 5y equals 13, and you got a negative 6x plus y equals 33. And they said use substitution. So I don't want you to think because they're going to have it stacked like this that you have to do elimination. Now, you can do either one. You can do substitution or you can do elimination, okay? If you did elimination, I would just simply take the bottom and multiply it by -5. Because by multiplying by -5, you're going to make the y cancel out. Okay? So, if I did elimination, that would give me the same top, which would be 8x plus 5y equals 13. But my bottom will change to a 30x minus 5y equals a negative 165. So when I combine, that would give me a 38x. My y's are gone, and it's equal to negative 165 plus 13 is a negative 152. Divide both sides by 38, and I get x equals a -4. So once you get x is -4, then you would just simply plug -4 back in for x, either in the top or the bottom. If you use the bottom to get your y, that would give you a positive 24 plus y equals 33. So you're going to subtract 24 from 33, and that would give you a positive 9. So my point of intersection would be -4, positive 9. And that's with elimination. Now, you do not have to use elimination. If you wanted to do substitution, you could simply separate it on your scratch paper into the two, because you know when I taught it, I did my substitution side by side. And the only one I would sub with would be the y, because it's single. And you would take 6x plus 33 and plug it in the place of y in the first one. So 8x plus 5 times 6x plus 33 would equal 13. And you would just simply do distributive property. And that would give me 8x plus 30x plus my 165 equals 13. And I would combine like terms. That would give me 38x equals 13 minus 165. And that's where you get your negative 152. And when you divide by 38, you get x to be -4. So it's the same, you get the same point. It's just showing you both methods. So if you plug -4 in for 6, you get -24 plus 33. And that's how you get +9. So your point of intersection would be -4, 9. So I showed both substitution and elimination, but you do not have to do one or the other. You just got to do one or the other method. You don't have to do the one that they say. Okay. Questions? I know that's like a mouthful, but that's a summation of every type of problem that we've gone over. Okay, for your final.